Good afternoon. As we wait for more people to join us today, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us for a conversation on Iran policy. I'm Rachel Rosen with the Communications Director for Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our entire staff, our President, Mark Melman, our board and our board co-chairs, Todd Richmond and Ann Lewis, whom you'll be hearing from a little bit later, welcome. We hope you and your loved ones are well and are enjoying the spring. In just a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Melman to introduce our distinguished guests. But first, I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. If you like what you're hearing today, please consider checking us out on social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, and we're on Instagram. You can sign up for our news and updates on our website, dmfi.org as well. And if you want to ask a question today, please submit it through the Q&A feature on your Zoom interface. And if you're on Facebook, you can type it into the comments section. I'm going to ask all the questions anonymously today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Melman.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for everything you do for DMFI. Much appreciated, the great work. I want to thank you all for joining DMFI for what I know will be a fascinating event with our two very special guests. Iran is certainly in the news these days, though we could have said that probably on almost any day in the last decade or two. But DMFI does have some clear views on this subject. First, we believe Iran must never get a nuclear weapon. Second, we believe that the best way to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapon state is through a diplomatic agreement. Third, we believe at the end of the day, we need an agreement or a set of agreements that are longer, stronger, and broader than the JCPOA. Now, I'm very happy to report that the Biden administration is committed to all three of those objectives, committed to preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear weapon state, committed to a diplomatic agreement, and committed to a longer, stronger, and broader set of agreements with Iran to deal with those issues. But how close are we to achieving those objectives? How do we accomplish those goals? How do we interpret recent events in light of those objectives? That's what we're here to consider today, and we could not have two more knowledgeable folks to help us work through the thicket of the news of the day. First, Ambassador Dennis Ross, who is counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Policy. He spent several years as Special Assistant to President Obama and the National Security Council Director, Senior Director for the Central Region, which includes Iran, and as a Special Advisor to Secretary of Hillary Clinton before that. He served as Middle East Coordinator under President Clinton, President Bill Clinton, as Director of the State Department's Policy Planning staff, the job that George Kennan famously held. Dennis is the author of several influential, most recently, Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny, with David Makovsky, and also recently of the very beautifully titled Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israel Relationship from Truman to Obama. David Albright is also with us. David is a physicist and is the founder and president of the Institute for Science and International Security in Washington, D.C., also known as the Good ISIS, also ISIS, but a very different ISIS. David is one of the world's leading experts on nuclear proliferation. He's written numerous assessments of secret nuclear weapons programs throughout the world. He's testified before Congress on numerous occasions. He worked for a number of years with the International Atomic Energy Agency Action Team, investigating nuclear weapons programs in various countries around the world. He's worked with the Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Energy, and served on the research staff at Princeton and at a variety of other institutions. So we're going to start first with Ambassador Ross, and then we'll hear from David Albright, and then we'll be delighted to open it to your questions.
Thanks, Mark, and it's good to be with you. It's good to be with David as well. So let me try to create kind of a context for our discussion that will deal maybe not immediately directly with the objectives that Mark laid out, but will allow us to sort of think about what the prospects are for them. And I want to start with a simple observation. That observation is that as someone who has worked on diplomacy for a long time, done negotiations and mediation, the one thing that always comes through is for diplomacy to be effective, you obviously have to have very clear objectives, but you also have to have leverage. You also have to have, usually, especially if you're dealing with an adversary like the Iranians, for whom the rules don't really apply unless they see the consequences of not fulfilling them, you really have to have a coercive edge to this as well. And I think if you look at the Biden administration's approach at this point, I think it's pretty much a sound approach, meaning compliance for compliance and no unilateral concessions. Now, the Iranians are responding to that approach with what I would describe as them taking a page from the Trump administration. They're applying maximum pressure. The maximum pressure obviously is guided by a sense that A, they want sanctions relief, and B, they're either hoping that their maximum pressure and coercion, either on us or on our allies, will lead us to do what they want, which is to provide them sanctions relief. I don't want to go through the full litany of everything they're doing, but I'll do a thumbnail sketch of this. I'm sure David will do more. But if you look on the nuclear program, they're enriching to 20%. They're fabricating uranium metal. Supreme Leader is talking about enriching to 60%. They have taken what is really the crown jewel of the JCPOA, which was the whole verification and monitoring system. They're making it clear they won't adhere voluntarily any longer to the additional protocol, meaning there can't be inspections of non-declared sites. Even on the declared sites, they're not allowing the kind of 24/7 access to information. So clearly on the nuclear program, they're trying to build pressures to say, look, we're going to lead towards a direction you really don't want to see unless you give us sanctions relief. And they haven't, as you know, at this point, they haven't been willing to come into even an informal 5+1 negotiating format to discuss how one might get back into compliance for compliance, because again, this is part of their maximum pressure. But we see their maximum pressure also in the region. We've seen it in terms of the Shia militia attacks on bases in Iraq, where we're located. We've seen it even in the last week where there have been attacks primarily from the Houthis, but throughout all of Saudi Arabia. Ras Tanura, which is maybe the most important oil export facility in the world, where 15% of the world's oil passes. They fired rockets at that, which is 900 miles away from Yemen. They hit in Yanbu on the Red Sea, in Jeddah, all hitting oil facilities, all basically in the last week. And this is part of an approach designed to ratchet pressure up with the aim of getting sanctions relief. So the administration at this point, as I said, is holding firm. My own guess is we'll know soon whether we're likely to see what is a step-by-step approach. Compliance for compliance really meant no lifting of the nuclear-related sanctions until the Iranians, in fact, were back in full compliance with the JCPOA. My guess is we'll see some kind of step-by-step approach, assuming the Supreme Leader feels a great urgency to get sanctions relief. If he does, we'll see, my guess is, a step-by-step approach where maybe there's a kind of parallelism that is created that is designed to get us each takes a step. They take a step, we take a step to relieve some sanctions, and that gets us back into the JCPOA. Maybe that happens before the Iranian election, or maybe the Supreme Leader chooses to wait until after the Iranian election and there's a new president. It is not, if you're looking at Rouhani or Zarif and thinking they're the decision makers, they're not, they're instruments. It depends on where the Supreme Leader comes out on this. But my guess is we're going to find ourselves back in the JCPOA. Mark, you're quite right. The administration has made it clear it wants to use that as a platform to then negotiate a longer and stronger agreement, but then also to deal with other issues like ballistic missiles and also Iran's behavior in the region. Now, the administration has the position, and it has a good argument for it, that once we're back in the JCPOA, we can hold the prospect of reimposing all the sanctions once again, if the Iranians, after a year or 18 months, haven't agreed to a follow-on JCPOA, basically a JCPOA 2.0, that plugs the holes, that basically extends the agreement, that strengthens it, and the like. And that could work for a JCPOA 2.0. The problem is it doesn't work for the region. And one of the objectives that the president has laid out is that we want to deal with Iran's behavior in the region. And here I would say, I mean, before we came on, we were mentioning Yitzhak Rabin. Here I would say it would make a lot of sense for the Biden administration to take a page from Yitzhak Rabin. What I mean by that is when Rabin recognized the PLO, he said, we're going to pursue peace as if there is no terror, and we're going to fight terror as if there is no peace. the Biden administration needs to adopt a similar kind of approach. The Iranian approach to the nuclear issue is to say that's separate and we can do whatever we want in the region. And the administration needs to adopt a similar kind of approach. If we want to be able to deter what the Iranians are doing in the region, we're going to have to raise the cost to the Iranians for what they're doing. And there are a number of things that we actually can do. One of the things I would say that we can do is just demonstrate we're prepared to compete. And what I mean by that is the following. One, raise the cost to the Iranians of what they're doing in Iraq. We can do much more to support the Iraqi military. We can mobilize the Saudis and the Emiratis to provide more material support, financial support for the Iraqi government. We want to increase the political space the Iraqi government has against Iran and the Shia militias there. Something else we need to do. We need to, in a sense, promote a very active, integrated missile defense that includes Israel and the Gulf states together as a way of blunting what the Iranians are doing in the missile defense area. We should also be promoting at the same time what amounts to a kind of contingency planning between, again, Israel and the Gulf states, with the focus not just on developing plans to deal with a range of different threats, but specific options for how to counter what the Shia militias are doing. We should do much more to expose what the Iranians are spending and doing in Syria. It's interesting, and I think in the Trump administration at one point said that the Iranians were spending $20 billion in Syria. And the Revolutionary Guard was sufficiently on the defensive because of that, and they said, no, that's not true. We're only spending $10 billion. Well, at a time when the country is being squeezed, that also creates a kind of pressure. We should be pushing in a very active way the normalization process because it creates a coalition, basically, against the Iranians. None of this is inconsistent with a diplomatic approach. All of it is a way to underpin our determination, on the one hand, to use diplomacy, but at the same time to compete with the Iranians. If we're going to be effective in terms of trying to achieve the objectives of lengthening and strengthening the JCPOA, but of also dealing with the other threats that the Iranians pose in the region, our strategy also has to, in a sense, have different parts to it. We are producing a diplomatic outlet for the Iranians. We're not necessarily denying them that possibility, but at the same time, we're making it very clear we will raise the cost to them of some of the things they do that they shouldn't be doing. All right, why don't I stop there? That, I think, provides a useful context to begin.
Mr. Albright.
No, thank you for the invitation to speak, and it's great to be here with you all. My group is a technical group, and we've studied the Iranian nuclear program. I'll say nuclear weapons program and their sensitive nuclear programs for a couple decades. And I'd like to make some comments today growing out of that. I'd also like to express some concerns about reinstituting the JCPOA, and I'll focus the second half of my talk on that. From my point of view, a real watershed in understanding Iran's nuclear program, particularly its nuclear weapons program, was when Israel successfully seized the Iranian nuclear archive in early 2018. With that set of documents, we have a much better understanding of Iran's nuclear weapons efforts. I mean, there was, as you all know, there was a crash nuclear weapons program in the early 2000s aimed at building 5 nuclear weapons, 4 missile deliverable, and 1 to be available to use in an underground nuclear test site. We identify typically 3 pillars of making a nuclear weapon: producing fissile material, in the case of Iran, weapon-grade uranium, weaponizing the weapon-grade uranium in a nuclear weaponization program, and then having a delivery system. And Iran's crash program was very active in all 3 areas. And as you also know, a lot of international pressure was brought to bear on Iran in 2002, 2003, including the US invasion of Iraq. And that led Iraq to decide not to build the nuclear weapons, not to finish this crash nuclear weapons program. But the archive also shows that they didn't end it. They made a decision not to build nuclear weapons, they made a decision to downsize, eliminate many of the production scale nuclear weaponization facilities. Interestingly, they didn't stop, they paused, but they didn't stop the facility to make weapon grade uranium, Fordow. They continued to build that in secret until it was exposed in 2009. And the delivery systems have continued essentially unabated. And it's a long story, and we're just finishing a book on this subject, but today we think Iran still has not decided to build nuclear weapons, but it's not a latent program like you would think of in Japan with its huge stock of separated plutonium. It's a program that's much more developed than that. It's a program that's ready to build nuclear weapons if it's ordered. In a sense, it can build nuclear weapons on demand. And what does that mean in terms of timelines to a bomb? One is for us who work in nonproliferation, the key thing you worry about is a test, an underground test. In the old days, it was above ground test, but now it's an underground test. Iran probably, in our view at ISIS, needs maybe 6 to 9 months to be able to detonate an explosive underground. And that assumes the current nuclear situation where, I'll come back to this, where there's a kind of a breakout timeline of about 3 months, the amount of time to get the weapon grade uranium. And then the other 3 to 6 months would account for the weaponization activities and preparing the test site. Iran will certainly need longer if it's going to mount a missile or mount a warhead on a missile. And assessments of that are extremely hard to do. We know a lot about what they accomplished and didn't accomplish on their bomb program and what gaps are. And so estimates of 1 to 2 years from now are make sense. But we also know that you look at other countries, the test is the key thing. And then you let your enemy worry about guessing how many bombs you have. In the current breakout scheme, Iran could produce enough weapon grade uranium in 6 months for 2 or 3 nuclear weapons. So it could then weaponize those. So the test to us is often the critical factor in timing a bomb program. Now, the archive also provides a better picture on how to stop Iran's nuclear weapons efforts, both via negotiations or diplomacy and force. I mean, my group is deeply opposed to violent means applied to nuclear program and scientists, but it's really not hard to figure out why Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was assassinated or killed in December. He was the father of the nuclear program. I mean, we see him as the Leslie Groves of Iran's nuclear weapons program. He's not an Oppenheimer, he's a Groves, and that to us makes him even more dangerous because he's the guy who can organize it all. He can bring it all together. So it's not surprising that he was targeted, and he's one of several that were targeted. And the archive makes clear that the ones who've been killed in most cases were leaders of the effort to not only build the program, the crash program, but to carry it over into the future. And some of the documentation acquired by the International Atomic Energy Agency shows how those people were actually working on bomb-related projects as recently as 2009, 2010. Another site, or a site that was blown up, Iran's centrifuge assembly site at Natanz, again, not surprising. It was getting ready or would be ready. It was finished, able to produce thousands of advanced centrifuges. Destroying it certainly sets back the program in another way. So, and I would expect these things to continue. We'll see what happens if negotiations start. But the archive and other information has opened up vulnerabilities of the program that some are going to have a hard time not taking advantage of. Now, on the negotiations, a central lesson of the archive is just how determined Iran has been to get nuclear weapons. And it's willing to devote considerable resources. It had the unity of all the top leadership of the Iranian regime, including Rouhani, back when the crash program was launched. And it's patient. I mean, Iran understood that in the international environment of 2003, it was very risky for it to move to build nuclear weapons, but it didn't abandon them. It continued, but in a more subdued, but a more patient way. And it brings me to the JCPOA. I mean, it's an agreement that in our business, we would say it kicks the can down the road. And that's fine. But we've done that in North Korea and it didn't work out so well. And so I think in the Iranian context, getting limitations that last to 2030 are fine from a US perspective, but they're really not that long to Iran. And I think you have to really look at that deal and try to make sense of just how to fix it. And I want to make sure I don't talk for too long, so let me speed up a bit. I mentioned the breakout of being 3 months now, and Dennis mentioned that Iran's making uranium metal and moving forward in advanced centrifuges, and all that's very scary. But if you look to the 2030, when the JCPOA nuclear limitations essentially end, you'll have a 3-month breakout time, rapidly decreasing. Within a few years, it could reach a few weeks or a few days, based on what Iran has said it would do. It's filed documents as part of the JCPOA, made public statements. So it would be going to these very low or short breakout timelines, but under a legitimized program. This is allowed under the JCPOA. And so if you're scared about today, you should be terrified of the future of 2030. Now, another problem we've had at our institute is when you combine the JCPOA with what we view as essentially weak inspections, which is what we believe existed through 2018 and really still exists today. And what do I mean by that? I mean, clearly there's great monitoring inspections at declared sites. The loss of the additional protocol is a serious loss. I mean, one of the nice things about the additional protocol is it facilitates access. So at a declared site like Natanz, within 2 hours, the IA can go to any building on that site. It makes going off-site a little easier, although the fundamental right of the IA to go to any site in Iran is embedded in the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, which still stands. But the IA couldn't do it. They've been very unsuccessful at accessing military sites. Usually it takes tremendous pressure. Iran delays. With the archive, the situation started to change. I mean, finally, the IA had strong information about what was the undeclared uranium, what were the undeclared sites, what were the undeclared activities. It's laid out in great detail. And so they could then move to start putting pressure on Iran, and Iran has got to give, but it barely gives. The last round, the IA said Iran's explanation on the undeclared material at one site lacked technical credibility. And so the issue is, can the IA do its job to get to the basic question, are there undeclared nuclear activities and materials in Iran? And the answer remains no. And I think that has to be seen as a very sobering thought in looking for any solution. Now, if you're going to have a JCPOA, I think it can be fixed. I participated in the Trump administration effort to try to fix the deal, which was blown out of the water by his sudden decision to renounce the deal. But many things were worked out in there of how do you strengthen it. I would prefer it be done in an extended negotiations rather than in a two-step process, because I am scared of losing the leverage, as Dennis raised. But I think we know what to fix. I mean, ideally we'd like to eliminate their enrichment program, but lengthening the sunsets would be very helpful. Maybe destroying the excess centrifuges. One of the things you worry about in the breakout is they can quickly redeploy centrifuges, which they are doing now. If you destroy the excess ones, it's a little harder. There was a wonderful section in the JCPOA on weaponization, nuclear weaponization, called Section T. It was never implemented, as far as I can tell. There was lip service to the monitoring, but it was never enforced. And it really gets at some critical nuclear weaponization activities that if it was taken seriously, could interfere in Iran's ability to build nuclear weapons if it decided to do that. Certainly you can link with the IA access to military sites to the deal. I mean, a lot of discussion on that for the JCPOA. I know, in a sense, our side lost on that completely, as far as we can, from our point of view. The IA was sort of just told to kind of sit back and take your time, because we're not going to help you really resolve this problem in the short term. Another one that we've come to as a result of the archive is that I think it makes sense to focus more on underground nuclear test sites. That there's a lot of information about what Iran was doing to build a nuclear test site. We don't think it ever built a shaft, but we think their work on it continued. And they probably have moved more into thinking of a tunnel rather than a shaft, somewhat like a tunnel like what North Korea did with a mountain. But it's that can be probed. I mean, it can interfere in Iran's ability to pull together that kind of capability. And then I think you do have to worry that at least that there's some bans on ICBMs. I mean, this was also part of the Trump administration fix. I mean, it's not enough, but at least a new deal should have that. I mean, ideally, you'd like to negotiate better limits, shorter ranges. And then you also want to make sure there's no nuclear and missile proliferation. So I think these things, in my mind, it'd be better to do them in a step-by-step process, starting now, not in a two-step process where you reestablish the JCPOA and then start working on these. I just don't see the leverage to do that. These are big steps, I understand, but I think they're necessary. And it's really based that Iran doesn't need nuclear weapons. I think there are people in Iran who understand that. It doesn't even need a uranium enrichment program. It's a waste of money unless you're going to build nuclear weapons. So I think a lot of these things Iran's being asked to give up are in the end are not that painful, particularly if it leads to greater international cooperation and a more stable region. So thank you. Hope I didn't go too long.
Great. Thanks so much, Mr. Albright and Ambassador Ross. Now we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the discussion. I wanted to encourage folks to please submit a Q&A. If you're on Zoom, you can type it in the Zoom interface. I'm going to ask all questions anonymously. I won't be using any names. If you're on Facebook, you can type it into the comments section. Mr. Albright, I'm going to throw the first one to you. It's regularly said that Iran was obeying the JCPOA until Trump withdrew. Is that correct? Does the IAEA report showing that they might have had undeclared nuclear material mean Iran would have been in violation of the JCPOA before?
No, exactly. I mean, the archive provided the evidence of how to get at the undeclared material. And the IAEA always said, I mean, they were kind of silenced in 2015, but they always said, if there's new information, we're going to act on it. And they have. Director General Grossi's really tried to move forward on this. I mean, it's hard, but and so Iran was not in violation of I would say, the JCPOA, the additional protocol, its comprehensive safeguards agreement, and the archive itself is, given its extent and what it covers, and that it was secret and curated. It's hard to reconcile that with the JCPOA's fundamental commitment that Iran would not seek nuclear weapons in any manner at all. And so I think the US negotiators understood that having a bomb program in your back pocket is not allowed under the JCPOA.
Ambassador Ross, anything you wanted to add there, or else I'll go to the next question?
I would say one of the interesting things about the archive, as David is pointing out, it's an incredible resource for the IAEA. I think it would be good for the new administration to send some people to spend some time going over the archive so that A, the Iranians see that this is part of the administration's approach, but B, also it should be part of what is going to be in the negotiations. I mean, what the most important thing to understand that the archive reveals is that the Iranians never gave up the idea of having a nuclear bomb. David said it well. The JCPOA basically did is it kicked the can down the road. The Iranians didn't give up the option. They simply deferred the option. And the fact that they preserved this archive meant that they preserved all the materials, everything they had done to put themselves in a position where they could have a bomb. If they were really serious about not wanting a bomb and foregoing the option, why would they preserve all of that?
Ambassador Ross, I'm going to ask you to be the first to address this next question. If the U.S. lifts sanctions to return to the nuclear agreement, what leverage will we have to get the longer, stronger and broader agreements that the administration wants?
Well, really, there's two levels of this. And the question, this is one that many critics of the JCPOA and many certainly countries in the region raise. Once the nuclear-related sanctions are lifted because we're back in the JCPOA, what interest do the Iranians have in doing anything else? And I think the answer is maybe twofold. One, precisely because we have legislatively mandated sanctions on terrorism and human rights, that creates a kind of interesting overhang. It created a chilling effect. It produced with this rather, I'll put it, ironic effort by Secretary of State Kerry in 2016, where he was traveling around Europe, encouraging European businesses and banks to invest in Iran because there were limitations still imposed on the American side. So number one, I think there is just the overhang of these other sanctions we have, if the Iranians want them lifted as well, as a way of getting much more significant economic benefit. Now, that leads to a point. It may be that what the Iranians actually, whatever they say, you know, all they want is to get this initial group of sanctions lifted and be able to sell their oil again and, you know, and be able to manage. If that's the case, the main leverage we would have would be to reimpose all these sanctions. The one thing the Trump administration demonstrated that even if other governments were opposed to our imposing these kinds of sanctions, secondary sanctions, the private sector was prepared to observe them. So you could say, like let's say the administration says, we're going to establish a one-year timetable to be able to reach a follow-on agreement that plugs the holes, that lengthens and straightens the JCPOA. And if we don't reach that in 1 year, then we're going to reimpose all the sanctions. So that would certainly create some incentive for the Iranians if their main preoccupation is sanctions relief. What I tried to suggest before, in the region, I still think you need to be doing other things. You need to be demonstrating you were prepared to raise the cost to the Iranians of what they're doing in the region. That's why I said, do more in Iraq, spotlight what they've been doing in Syria, do more with others in the region to raise their capability to counter what the Iranians are doing. And one of the things to remember, and I'll conclude with this, Iran basically has leverage and influence. And every place where they have it, those are states that are either failed or failing. They're hardly an attractive model to anybody else in the region.
I'd like to add one thing. I mean, again, I have worry about this. I certainly worried about losing leverage. I mean, one thing that would help if the U.S. was going to pursue that approach of giving 12 months or 18 months, is that they line up beforehand, like essentially now, a common position with the Europeans, put the Chinese and the French on notice that this is exactly what they're going to do, and that everyone knows up front, and the Europeans are on board on the idea because they're traditionally going to try to keep the JCPOA going once it's reestablished. They're going to drag their feet on any kind of reimposition of nuclear sanctions and just argue we'll end up back where we started after the Trump administration. So, but if the U.S. is very clear about it, has the Europeans on board, and has put China and Russia on notice that this is exactly what's going to happen, then I think it would have more chance of succeeding.
I add just one point that I completely agree with that. I would say there's one other thing we need to be doing. We need to be very clear in public that we seek a diplomatic outcome, but we will prevent the Iranians from becoming a threshold nuclear weapons state. And it's important to say that publicly. First, because the Iranians need to understand it. Secondly, because it sends a message to the Iranians that we're preparing the international community, that while we favor diplomacy and we're going to pursue diplomacy, if the Iranians make it impossible through diplomacy to succeed, we will, in fact, be prepared to act militarily to ensure that they do not have that capability. I think that is also part of what it takes to maintain leverage.
I have a question here about sunset clauses. Thank you both for this great talk. A distinction has been made between the timing of the various sunset clauses in the JCPOA. Can you discuss which soon expiring sunset clauses are of greatest concern and which are still in effect for a while? Mr. Albright, do you want to...
Yeah, there's a whole range of sunsets. I mean, the ones we traditionally focus on are the ones that have concrete implications. You know, a sunset where Iran could start manufacturing advanced centrifuges. Maybe not the whole thing, but part that starts, you know, in 2023, that can first take place. You know, in 2025, there's a sunset that expires that would allow them to start redeploying advanced centrifuges such as the IR2M, IR4, and building a considerable number. You know, at year 15 is a critical time when their stock of low enriched uranium wouldn't be limited anymore. They could have as much as they wanted. They could make 20% again. In fact, they could make any enrichment they wanted. I don't think they would, but they could, at least under a civil program. And so you have a kind of an unpeeling of these sunsets starting in 2023 and then accelerating after 2025. And then essentially those key limitations ending in 2030.
Ambassador Ross, I'm going to go to the next question for you. Is Ambassador Ross saying that the administration's position is that if Iran refuses to agree to a JCPOA 2.0, that the U.S. will withdraw from the JCPOA 1.0, even if Iran isn't fully in compliance with JCPOA 1.0?
Well, that's not what I said. What I said is that if you're back in the JCPOA, I'm assuming that we're going to end up back in the JCPOA. And that then raises the question of what incentive do the Iranians, after they're back in the JCPOA and we have lifted the nuclear-related sanctions, what incentives do the Iranians have then to negotiate these additional limits? They, of course, say they will not. So what is going to produce that? Now, if they understand that after, say, a 12 to 18-month period, that we will reimpose the sanctions, and as David says, we actually reach some understandings in advance. We put everybody on notice, this is where we're headed, not just the Iranians, but everybody. And even try to, at least with the Europeans, reach some understandings that they will join in that. That has the potential to build leverage on the Iranians so that the Iranians, at that point, will decide that they'll go along with what, in a sense, we're asking for. Now, the truth is, if we're asking for more from them, they're going to ask for more from us. And it will be very difficult for us to produce what they will ask, which is we remove all the legislatively mandated sanctions, meaning in the human rights area and terror as well. So what could be done for that? Here's not just the disincentive side of this, but the incentive side of it. You know, there's more we could do, as an example, in terms of creating special purpose vehicles where licenses could be granted, and there would be a clear understanding of how that would relate to possible investment within Iran. So if you're going to get to more for more, that's in a sense how you would do it. But you're not going to get, you're not going to get to JCPOA 2.0 that deals with the sunset provisions the way David is suggesting, meaning lengthen them very far out, unless the Iranians see that there's a real cost to them of not doing that. That's what we've been talking about in terms of how do you raise your leverage. And I measure leverage, not just economically, but politically. Do everything you can to isolate the Iranians. Make it clear that we've mobilized the rest of the world, and their posture of not accepting a follow-on agreement is not going to be accepted internationally. have the economic pressures ready to go, but also be very clear that we're not going to accept them becoming a nuclear weapon state or a threshold nuclear weapon state, meaning where they end up with a posture where, they can decide on literally a moment's notice if they want to present the world with a nuclear weapons fait accompli.
Mr. Albright, here's a question about U.S. intelligence. Historically, how accurate has U.S. intelligence been in knowing about the weapons of mass destruction programs of countries like Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Pakistan, India, et cetera?
Well, it's a lot of countries to cover. I mean, it's. I think overall they've done a pretty good job. I mean, I think I could go through the whole saga of Iraq, where that was very tough. On Iran, I think, I don't think the program ended in 2003 as was assessed, at least with moderate confidence, in a 2007 National Intelligence Estimate. And I think even some of the authors of that are probably wouldn't interpret that strictly. They may look more at a program that halted, but maybe parts continued. But so I think they're not perfect. But I think on Iran, they've done a pretty good job. And one of the nice things in the 2007 NIE, they correctly identified that, I think they overstated it, but they did identify that a crashed nuclear weapons program had ended. They missed, I think, that part of it continued, but that was a pretty major victory. And I think in recent years, the Western intelligence combined, and they do work together, has done a pretty remarkable job. I think Israel has gone public with its victories, with the archive, with the Turkish Abad site where equipment and materiel was stored. And that's where the IA found, when they finally got in there after a huge struggle, found undeclared uranium. And so, or at least one of the sites they founded. So I think the intelligence has provided important information for policymakers and for the International Atomic Energy Agency, and feel pretty good about what's happened on Iran. Other countries, it's really, Iraq is well known. First, it was underestimated in the late 80s, and I shared in that underestimation of the Iraqi nuclear weapons program. I didn't share in the 2003, 2002 assessment of the U.S. intelligence. Thought that was a bogus assessment. And they, have rightly been criticized for that. And then on Syria, they did pretty well with information given to them by Israel to identify, confirm the secret nuclear reactor in Syria. So, but anyway, I think and probably just should say that U.S. intelligence is vital in the whole process of dealing with Iran, and both on the detection side, but I would also say, and again, this is not our area, but on the offensive side, that military strikes are not very feasible, but other types of forceful measures can be. And I think Dennis in an article wrote that maybe the U.S. should start maybe even exploring some of these, but not taking credit. And sometimes that's happened in the past, I know, but it may be that's a corollary of Rabin's rule that you mentioned of involving terror and peace.
Ambassador Ross, you touched on this in your opening remarks, but do you think Iran's upcoming elections will have any impact on future negotiations on their nuclear program?
I think the Iranians want us to feel that. I don't see it. I see, Rouhani and Zarif are basically those who carry out what the policy is going to be. Do they influence it? Maybe to some extent, but it's really the Supreme Leader. If the Supreme Leader didn't want there to be a JCPOA, there wouldn't have been a JCPOA. And the fact is, if the Supreme Leader decides that the only way they can get the sanctions relief that they want is by going back into the JCPOA, which they say they will do. They'll do that whether it's before the election or they'll do that after the election. The real question is going to be what comes down the road. And, you know, what happens when the Supreme Leader is no longer there. The weight and growth of the Revolutionary Guard in the decision-making process, I think is, you know, more and more a reality. But does that mean that they don't reach agreements when they think it's in their interests? No, they reach agreements when they think it's in their interests. So I think the key thing to watch is how soon they're ready to get back into a diplomatic process, because that'll tell us a lot about how urgent they think sanctions relief is.
I have another question about recent peace agreements between Israel and some of its neighbors. The dynamics in the Middle East are different than they were in 2015 when the JCPO was established. What impact do you think the Abraham Accords and the strengthened relationship between Israel and many of its neighbors will now have as the West approaches Iran?
Want me to start with that?
Sure, please.
Yeah. Look, I think when they first took place, I think it was probably a shock to the Iranians. And the reason I say this is because I think the Iranians had positioned themselves believing they could exploit the Palestinian issue to keep Arab regimes on the defensive. And suddenly they saw two things. A, these Arab governments, these Arab leaders didn't have a fear. The Palestinian issue was no longer something that they feared could be used against them. And they put their own national needs, their own interests, absolutely first. That may have been true historically, but they were always showing a hesitancy to be seen as being put in a position where the Palestinians could say, you're betraying the Palestinian national cause. So what we've now seen is that's not going to be a motivating factor. It's not going to shape what Arab leaders do, number one. The second thing, it shows that there'll be much closer cooperation against the Iranians, that there'll be much more of a bulwark against the Iranians within the region. I would very much like to see the Biden administration, which it says it supports the Abraham Accords, says it supports building on them. I'd like to see the Biden administration begin to take active steps to try to promote these, because I do think it's part and parcel of a strategy that's effective against the Iranians, to show the Iranians, look, your ability to transform this region in a negative way, your ability to extend your efforts to destabilize, they're going to fail. And there's a strong coalition against what you're doing. It's in your interest to stop doing it.
Let me add one thing to that is on the negotiations on the nuclear side. I mean, I think it's very important the Biden administration include the Arab states in Israel in the negotiations, maybe not as direct negotiators, but is brought into the process, and that a deal be sculpted that if not fully agreed to by them, can be mostly agreed by. So that it's not a deal they want to that they feel isolated from and want to destroy.
You know, let me even add one more thought on this. For the Saudis in particular, who have said, if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, we'll get one. They should be part of this, not only because they're affected by it, but it may affect some of the decisions they make. They are increasingly interested in developing civil nuclear power. If they see certain kinds of continuing loopholes for the Iranians, they're likely to ask for that as well. So we need to put ourselves in a position where not only does that guide us in negotiations, but it also guides us in terms of what we're doing with the Saudis.
We have time for one or two more, and I'll ask both of you to please address this next one. Threats of future actions, sanctions against Iran have not worked in the past. Why do you think it will now? How would either Mr. Albright or Ambassador Ross suggest practically negotiating with Iran in a way that will bring them to the table?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Sure. The first part is threats of future sanctions against Iran have not worked in the past. Why do you think they would work now?
Maybe Dennis should answer this more than I, but from my look at this, looking at the reactions inside their nuclear program, I think they've actually worked pretty well. I mean, I think it may not be the only thing that's needed, as the archive shows that it was a combination of things. But certainly Iran was worried about sanctions being imposed on them. They were also worried about US invasion. So they were worried about a lot of international condemnation. I think after 2010's imposition of sanctions, that put a lot of pressure on Iran that then bore fruit.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Go back and look at what the Iranians said during the Obama administration. They said, we will not negotiate on our nuclear program so long as we're under sanctions. And with the Congress, what we ended up doing is we tripled down, not double down, we tripled down on the sanctions. And guess what? They negotiated. The history with the Iranians is they're not going to transform who they are, but they will make tactical adjustments that can have a strategic consequence when the pressure is high enough on them. I see very few examples of where they're induced into changing their behavior. I see many examples where when the price became too high, they made a choice. You know, Khomeini said they would fight the war with Iraq however long it took. When the price got too high, he ends up ending the war and describing it as drinking poison from a chalice. In the 1990s, when they were carrying out assassinations of dissidents in Europe, and the Germans and others said, we're going to sanction you, they stopped the campaign of assassinations. When we defeated the Iraqi military in 3 weeks, so a military they couldn't defeat in 8.5 years, and they thought they were next, suddenly they were prepared to suspend their nuclear enrichment. And as I said, with the Obama administration, they're never going to negotiate so long as they're under sanctions. That's precisely what they did when we actually imposed much greater sanctions. So I think the argument that's being made here actually is that the threat of sanctions actually does work, and we shouldn't dismiss that.
Mr. Albright and Ambassador Ross, thank you so much for joining us. This was a very insightful conversation. I certainly learned a lot. I'm going to turn it over to our board co-chair, Ann Lewis, to close us out.
Thank you, Ambassador Dennis Ross and David Albright, president of the Good ISIS. I'm told that, okay, I have to start my video now. Sorry about that. Let's do it again. Thank you, Ambassador Dennis Ross. Thank you, David Albright, for reminding us there is a good ISIS as well. Thank you both for your wise words and for your years of public service. And thanks to all of you I can't see for being with us today. At DMFI, we're going to stay focused on this important issue, and we hope that you're going to stay in touch. So if you don't already get our emails, please sign up, follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you name it, we're there. Goodbye. See you on the next Zoom.
Thanks, gentlemen. That was really, really wonderful. Appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Fantastic.